And now it's time for Murderella's Lecture Hall of Horrors. Put lots of emphasis on horrors.
Yes, well, I suppose that was almost good enough. So, is Silent Night, Bloody Night a slasher movie? A fairly simple question, but one that unfortunately requires asking a much more complicated one. What is a slasher movie? In order to know if a label applies, we must first understand what that label actually means. And the more specific we get with a label, the more specific we have to be with our definitions. Horror itself is very broad and as such has a very broad definition, but slashers are a specific subgenre or even a sub-subgenre, which must have specific rules and definitions in order for that label to actually be useful. And in the discussion of slasher history, popular interpretation usually cites 1978's Halloween as the first true slasher film, with earlier films such as Black Christmas, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Drive-In Massacre seen as proto-slashers, films that influence slashers but should not be considered part of the subgenre themselves. So, what we must do is look at the movies that we know are considered slashers and the movies that we know are not, and then from that determine a set of criteria which will include the former while excluding the latter. Which of course I have already done to create Murderella's 5-point slasher checklist, a set of 5 simple criteria that should do a fairly good job of filtering all of the movies that could be considered slashers down to only the ones that should be. However, it is also important to note that my work here is based on that of earlier academics, most notably Carol Clover and Vera Ditka, who wrote some of the earliest analyses of the slasher subgenre. And while their works are primarily focused on analysis, my goal here is purely in determining a method of classification, and as such will be focused on very broad structural elements, while largely ignoring many of the important thematic ones which do require significantly more subjective interpretation. So with all of that out of the way, let's begin, shall we? Number 1. The killer is, or was, human. Whether a hulking undead juggernaut, dream demon, possessed doll, or just some guy in a costume, one of the biggest defining factors of a slasher is that they are, or were, human, and more importantly, have a human intellect and human motivations. That isn't saying that those motivations need to be good, just human. If you watched the Child's Play remake and couldn't quite put your finger on why it felt so flat compared to the original, that's the reason. They replaced a possessed doll with human intellect and motivations with a malfunctioning doll with neither. And this does mostly disqualify anything that could also be considered a monster movie. While Alien Xenomorph does stalk and pick off victims one by one, and that film does arguably meet every other criteria on this list, its motivations are purely animalistic. It is in no reasonable way human. Number 2. The killer is the antagonist. While people do watch slasher films for the killer, the plot of those films is never about the killer. While slasher films do often invite audiences to experience the narrative from both the killer and victim's perspective, the narrative itself is always focused on the victims, not the killer. Which disqualifies films like Criminally Insane, Peeping Tom, or any other where the killer is the protagonist. Or rather where it is known that the protagonist is the killer. Number 3. The killer is relevant. And this is where we are really going to start cutting out these pseudo-slashers. In simplest terms, to be a true slasher film, the killer needs to be personally relevant. Relevant to the larger narrative, relevant to the location, relevant to the characters, just relevant in some meaningful way to something outside their role as the film's killer. Now, admittedly, relevant in some meaningful way is not the easiest thing to define, but fortunately, I have a little trick that I like to call the bear test. If you have a film that easily passes points 1 and 2, but you're not sure if the killer is relevant, simply consider this question. Could you replace the killer with a bear without radically changing the plot? You could not substitute a bear into Friday the 13th, Child's Play, or Scream without radically changing the plot of the movie. But if you did the same with Final Exam or The Slumber Party Massacre, you simply need to change Teens Terrorized by Random Man to Teens Terrorized by Random Bear. While the presence of a killer in the movie is relevant, who that killer actually is has no impact on anything. And this is where we must cut off Black Christmas. While the killer could not be replaced with a bear, he could easily be replaced with anyone capable of using a phone. His presence and actions are relevant, but his identity is not. Number 4. The killer is proactive. A slasher killer actively pursues their victims. They stalk, sometimes they taunt, but they don't just wait for the victims to come to them. This is another one that can be a bit difficult to determine, and unfortunately I don't have an amusingly helpful test for it. The best thing I can come up with is the killer acting or reacting? For example, let's compare the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Friday the 13th, Part 3. Both films feature a plot where hapless victims wander into the territory of a killer or killers. The difference being that while Jason actively stalks and picks off his victims one by one, the Sawyers largely just react as the victims stumble into them. And finally, number 5. Effects of a past event are felt in the present. Arguably the most important point, or rather the one that draws the most specific line between slashers and simple serial killers. In a slasher movie, the past has weight. There is some specific inciting incident in the past that is meaningfully tied to events in the present. Michael Myers murders his sister, Jason drowns in a lake, Freddy is burned alive by a mob, Charles Lee Ray is gunned down by the police, a student is traumatized by a cruel prank, Sidney Prescott's mother is murdered. All past events that are both meaningful to the overall plot and in some way come back in the present. And this, as the most specific point, is also the one that's most open to interpretation and the trickiest to judge. In most of those examples provided, the past event takes years to come back, but in Child's Play it's only days. But the important thing is that the event be both specific and be directly connected to the events of the present. For example, in Slumber Party Massacre, we are simply dealing with an escaped serial killer. You could say that his prior murders are an inciting incident, but neither they nor him are directly related to anything else in the movie. Whereas in Halloween, the killing of Judith Myers is a single specific event that sent Michael Myers down the path that he would follow on the night he came home. So now that we have our criteria, let's run some movies through and see how they do. Halloween, 5 out of 5. Friday the 13th, 5 out of 5. Prom Night, Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, even Bring It On, Cheer or Die, 5 out of 5. But Black Christmas, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Drive-In Massacre, and Slumber Party Massacre, 3 out of 5. Of course, as with any attempt to categorize art, this is far from perfect. While these criteria may seem overly strict to some, they are intentionally broad and provide far more false positives than negatives. As mentioned earlier, despite being disqualified by the very first point, Alien actually goes on to meet the other 4 criteria, and Anthropophagus meets every single one without question, despite not even seeming like a slasher at all. But overall, I would consider these 5 criteria to be sufficient in at least determining which films are worth including in the conversation. And I believe that about covers it, so any questions? Okay, and what about the movie that we are watching, the one that I supposedly asked about? Well, I wouldn't want to spoil anything, would I? So let's just come back to that question later. And for now, get back to Silent Night, Bloody Night.